Welcome back to JKLIVE, folks. 5 days to go before the general election, and this is an important show. We are looking at the polls, that's right, and the pollsters behind the polls. What are the polls all about? How believable are they? And should we take them seriously? Well, we're in the house. David Ndii, Head of Policy and Programs for the William Ruto presidential campaign. He's sitting right next to me. Right next to him is Angela Mbito. She's the CEO of InfoTrack. Right next to her is Saitabao Ole-Koncheri, presidential agent with Azimio. And right next to him, Samuel Mudoka, Director for Central Development and Research at Ipsos. It's all about the polls. Let me ask a very simple question, Angela. Why should the polls not continue? Today was the last day that polls could be conducted or released, right?
Correct.
Why is that? I know it's the law, but why can't polls go all the way to what, maybe before Election Day?
First of all, just to give you some genesis, this law was mooted in 2017, just before the 2017 elections, and was tabled by Boni Alwale. And at that point, what was happening and what had happened in the previous election is there were specific quote-unquote pollsters who were not really pollsters who would come. They were fly-by-night pollsters. They would come in only on election during the election cycle, and they would be spewing out very, suspicious polls. So that was one. The second thing was that obviously polls were gaining impetus in the country and making very many quarters feel uncomfortable, because polls can only please sometimes but one party. You can't have two winners. Politics has been touted as a zero-sum game. So one party loses, another one will gain, because it's a competition. And so what happened is there was a lot of talk in Parliament about banning polls. And the question then that was discussed in the same Parliament, because they knew that at one point the polls will be for us, but there are times that the polls will be against us. So we know we need them, because indeed most of the legislators were appreciative of what polls were, scientific in their nature if they're done well, and representing the voice of the people. So to reach a middle ground, Boni then approached the Market Research Association then, which we, Ipsos and InfoTrack belong to, and said, we want to come up with this law that actually, can help mitigate any concerns that different stakeholders have. We then, as an association, provided best practice across the globe and said, this is what happens in different places. Very many countries don't actually regulate publication of opinion polls. But if we want to do it, this is what happens in South Africa, or this is what happens in Europe, this is what happens in America, etc. In many cases, we found that in most countries, the window was actually about 24 to 48 hours. But because of the high octane nature of our politics, it is we, the Market Research Association, that advocated and advised on the window and said 5 to 7 days for us is okay, because we cannot control those who are not members of the association. Yeah. That was one. We also then gave all the details in terms of the 14 core areas that we expected a good pollster to cover in terms of their methodology. Okay. So most of the credible pollsters actually are happy with what the law says, because we participated in helping Boni craft the law. Yeah.
But David, the Kenyans are still very suspicious of polls, aren't they? Still to this day, they're still very suspicious.
Kenyans have difficulties being politically objective. They reason with their heart when it comes to politics. Politicians are even worse. I find politicians react very badly to polls which they are not leading.
Right.
So, but the next week, if they're leading, they react positively. When they're not leading, they raise questions about sample. Okay, let me give you an anecdote. I collected the first ever opinion polls when multi-party came.
You did?
Yes, I did. I was the first pollster in Kenya after multi-party. And we were to do 3 polls. And we were sort of aligned to the opposition. So we did the first poll, and it showed the people who are very active in the opposition then were very sort of that level are pro-Kibaki. And it showed, I think, Matiba was leading, or Moi, I don't recall quite, whatever. And they accepted poll, and we actually listened through, and it was actually published in the Nation and newspapers. Then we did the second poll. I remember, yeah, Moi was first, Kibaki was second, Matiba was far behind, and Jaramogi was last. Then I did the second poll. These people called themselves the Council of Elders or something. Opposition, they had people like Joe and Jui and other Kibaki friends. We then did the second one. And when we went to the second one, Moi was still ahead. Matiba had overtaken Kibaki. It was done exactly the same way. The same people. They started questioning the methodology, all manner of things. And we still managed to publish it, even though they were like the sponsors. But we wanted to do an exit poll. We couldn't do it. They refused to agree for us. I was very young then, so I didn't have sort of anywhere with to go around them. But that's the character of our politics. People will accept what favors them, and they will reject what doesn't favor them, even if it's exactly the same thing, following exactly the same methodology. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Saidaba, let me ask you this. About 2 weeks ago, the undecideds were about 10%. I think this week it came down to around 7%. How can you not be decided 5 days to the general election? Or are those the undecided the ones that aren't going to bother to vote?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for having me on the bench. It's my first time on the bench.
Karibu sana.
And as you can imagine, I'm very excited. So, sometime in, I think it was February or March this year, at the time I was a member of the Raila Odinga Presidential Campaign Board. And in one of our sessions, I said, the undecided will decide this election. This is an election where the undecided will decide. And you know, just to answer your question, initially, there was nothing exciting, you know, about this election. So we've had 4 years of, you know, practically campaigns from various quarters. It's only about February, March this year that the excitement began to kick in. And every voter in this country who is undecided will have to decide. Many of them are calling themselves undecided because they just don't want to, you know, they have already decided, by the way, to be honest with you. And I was telling Daktari here before we came on, all the undecided are ours because they have had a long time on the campaign trail to convince them. The fact that maybe 4 years, let me not say 9 years, but it's actually been more than 4 years that the Kenya Kwanza guys have been on the campaign trail. You know, there was a time we used to call them tanga-tanga. Yes. So if you had all that, you know, activity in all manner of places and you were not able to convince people to make up their minds, then those people are not going to make up their minds a week to the election or 5 days to the election. So the undecided were waiting for something exciting. They were waiting for something interesting. In February, they were 30%. Yeah, if Angela would bear me witness and my brother here, they were 30%. And at that time, Raila Odinga was trailing William Ruto. As soon as the undecided began to decide, Raila Odinga, you know, got his head, you know, ahead of the race. And the undecided are still going to, you know, the 7%, they're the ones who will take us over the top. Right.
Interesting. Yes. How reliable are opinion polls, Samuel?
Jeff, thank you very much. I will insist again that when the process that is laid down by science is followed, that is what professors taught in school, that is what we've learned, that is what we've practiced. And remember, it is a process that is heavily following a protocol. If it is followed to the latter, there's absolutely no reason why we could doubt this. Remember, it is an investment. And these organizations that put their monies into an opinion poll to invest in it, as long as it follows the due process and the, the laid down procedure, the science, I think we need to have some faith into it. And let me give you this analogy, Prof. My mother and many of our mothers, when they cook food, of course, they don't eat all of the food to find out whether it is salty. Just take a small pinch of it, and then they find, yeah, the food is good. And that is the science. That is an analogy of sampling, how you get a subset of a sample, and then you are able to actually tell that is a fact. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of Ipsos because we followed due process. There must have been a reason why we decided to do this one opinion poll, follow the guidelines and the processes, not only lay down locally, but also global best practices to deliver what we have delivered at the end of the day. And we stand by it. And we are neutral. We do not support any of these political parties because we are neutral to that. And we are not standing on their constituency, but telling Kenya the truth.
Angela, maybe you can tell us, even the latest polls, no one has above 50%.
Correct.
In other words, the threshold to be declared president, 50 plus 1, no one, is near, at least 3-4 points behind. Can that change?
That's not true. Let me correct you. I think, let us be clear on the polls that were released yesterday, and I believe one was released today. So the Ipsos poll is at 47, 41.
47, 41.
47 for Raila, 41 for Ruto. We conducted 2 polls in the last 2 days. They're the latest polls. Yours are a little older, isn't it? Because you finished your polls when?
On 30th.
On 30th. We did our polls 1st and 2nd August, okay? The poll that we conducted for Nation was done on the 1st, and the result was 49-41. So 41 like them, but 49 for Raila. Plus or minus 2. I think yours was plus or minus 1. Margin of error. Our poll, which is 6,000, is 49-42. Plus or minus 1. And I believe one was released today, 49-41. Plus or minus 1 means that it can either be 50 and above, or it can be 48. Okay? The other thing that we need to make clear to everyone watching, and I think that has been mentioned by, you're not Saibaba.
Saitabal.
Saitabal. Saitabal amesema,
Wow.
okay? There will be no undecided. So the 6%, it's not 7, 6% who are undecided right now will on that day be very decisive on what they're going to do. Now, maybe these are the people who need more convincing than the rest of us. Yeah? They are not the very, easy to sway person. So maybe they're the ones who want to know, is it really going to be the yellow, or is it, and it's interesting, they're wearing yellow or blue? And what do either of these parties really say to me that makes my loyalty sway to them? Now, if that happens, whoever is able to, in this window of 3 days that they're allowed to campaign, because the campaigns will close on Saturday.
Correct.
If by Saturday they're able to convince, let me tell you who the undecided voter predominantly is now, and I sent you the report, I think all of you have it, is predominantly female. So whoever is able to convince the 60% of the undecided pot, which is now 60% female, 60%, 50% young, youth, and also predominantly in the mountain. A third of the undecided, 27%, are in Mount Kenya. Okay? Whoever is able to convince that, a third is consolidated, 0.2 million is in at the coast, 0.2 million is in Western, and another 0.2 million is in Nairobi. Whoever is able to convince that person will win the election. Now, you then have to ask yourself, who is closest to the finishing line? Because sometimes we want to pussyfoot. Who is closest? Now, that does not necessarily mean the person who's closest will win. Like we were discussing earlier with David out there, is that we also have vote-rich regions. Like Mount Kenya, as we speak, has 4.7 million voters, followed by Nyanza, which is about 3.6. Okay, or between 3.2 3.6, somewhere you can check. But having said that, if, for instance, today, in the next 3 days, the team of UDA can say, listen, guys, you are our melting pot. You are the reason for our raison d'etre, okay? Then they can flip the election. And so it's very difficult to call it, but if you say all factors remain constant, then it is a no-brainer that the person who is closest to the finishing line and can convince the people in Nairobi, some people in Mountain, some people at the coast who are undecided to come to them, because these people will vote, without a doubt. Majority of them will vote. We are predicting that out of the 1.3 million in the pot who are undecided, 1 million would vote. If you can get 60 or 50% of that 1 million, and you're already at a specific number, you're home and dry.
David,
because you need 50 plus 1.
You're shaking your head.
Yeah, it's actually not true. They will not vote. If you look at their numbers, they will tell you that the expected voter turnout is 75%.
Yes.
So if 75% is the voter turnout, 25% of the voters will not vote. So if the undecided is 7-8%, in fact, the number that will not vote is actually bigger than the undecided. Okay? So you cannot say they will vote, because we do know, in fact, turnout will, and I agree, turnout will be about 75%. That's a percent that we can expect.
David, you're taking the 75% from the numbers I sent you.
No, it's a normal turnout. I'm just making the logic.
Yeah.
The logic of saying that the undecided will vote means that 100% will vote.
No.
So the point is the following.
That is not
but
what
that
I
was
have
actually not the
said.
main point I was going to make. I wanted to move on and say, our poll, to respond to the question, are polls believable? And he talked about the science of polling, and it's actually science of survey. And they said if you follow the protocols and everything, they would be believable. That's also not quite true, but not for that fault. The most fundamental thing about a survey and polls is having a good sampling frame. And the sampling frame is you want for an election is probably your voter register. They don't have it, they don't use it, we have it, we use it, but those are private polls. If you look at the sampling frames that have been used, you can actually see problems with the sample, because you don't look at the results, go to the demographics. In her latest poll, if you go to the demographics, the number of people with university and college education is 30%. Okay? That already tells you there's a problem with that sample, because the 30% in college and university education is not representative of the population. So you can already see that the sampling frames or themselves have issues. The next important thing is the sample itself. Are you able to actually completely randomize your sample and have it sampling? If you're doing an aggregate national poll and you have the correct sampling frame, you're sampling, for example, from the registered voters, you can actually do a national poll of 500 voters and it will give you a national figure. But however, if you don't have a random sample, there are things you need to do, and I don't see them in many of their polls. For example, I see poll with TIFA done with 2,000 something votes, and then it's broken down to regions, 8 regions. You can't do that, because if you're going to disaggregate to regions, you need, by certain sampling sort of methodologies, about 450 people per region. So you need at least 3,500. Have 6,000 sort of people poll is broken down to counties. You can't do that. The minimum disaggregation sample you need to disaggregate to counties is about 19,000. So I agree that if you actually did it correctly, it would give you the opinion at that point in time. What it also doesn't tell you, which is why polls all over the world sometimes do not correspond to the election, is voter behavior. A very significant one is turnout. Now, in this country, we have a pattern. The place with the presidential candidates usually has turnout of 85% or thereabouts and above. The place with a running mate usually has a turnout of 75%. And the rest of the country have turnouts of 60 or thereabouts. So if you wanted to weight your voter sort of whatever properly, you would weight like now Luo Nyanza and Kalenjin Rift Valley at a bigger percentage, and you would weight Northeastern very low because turnout is likely to be about 50. Now, all these polls don't do that. Finally, you have another non-statistical error called when people don't tell you the truth. And where you have the kind of election now where you have a candidate who is favored by the state, sometimes people tell you what they think you want to hear, especially if they think you are aligned to that side. And because certain pollsters are associated publicly with particular places, you get that kind of bias because they say these people are pro so-and-so, or I'm afraid of the state knowing that I am not voting stateside. So you also have that kind of bias. So yes, if they were scientific, they would be, but they would still not capture everything. There are things you need, more analysis you need to do. But our polls those things are there. There are limitations. Every survey has limitations. But you don't see those limitations as acknowledged as much as we should.
Yeah, I know Angela's dying to jump in there. But before you do that, Angela, real quick, Samuel, you go first. Since you were talking about science earlier on. You go first. And Angela, I know you're dying to jump in.
Yeah.
Go.
Let me first start by saying that, you know, in probability, because probability is a science, you know, the mathematics and the statistics behind what guides us, there are some two common laws or some two common standpoints that are very, very clearly known. What we call the law of large numbers and what we call the central limit theorem. Now, law of large numbers, if you do one thing and you repeat it, you know, many times, one thing, for example, if you are asking this person, who will you vote for, and then that is repeated many, many, many times. At the end of the day, the kind of experience kind of almost follows a straight line. Now, each and every other poll that we've done, we clearly, because a 6,000 sample is not a small sample, but you clearly designate what we call a margin of error. When the sample is bigger, the margins of error are small. You have a bigger leeway in terms of the interpretation. When the samples now are disaggregated to smaller units, the margins of error get very, very big, such that you cannot even have the, you know, the leeway to make an interpretation out of them. Now, what Prof says about limitations is a very correct standpoint. Each and every piece of research has a limitation. And when you look at the interpretation of our numbers, those limitations sometimes are very, very clearly set. For example, when we say that we do not see a clear leader in this. However, voter intention in a situation where you have undecided voters is a moving line. It cannot solidify until the last minute. There's still a lot of campaigns that are going on that will still influence voters up to the last minute. So at the point at which this was done, that was the outcome. Can that change? Absolutely. I've just seen some news from Citizen. I hope I can confirm whether they are true or not true.
Go on.
About Wajakoya and the fact that it's likely to be moving towards, deviating towards one of the candidates.
He and his running mate cannot agree, apparently, on who to back.
Absolutely. So what does that say to the 2%,
What do you mean?
3% persons who told us that they would vote him? What would that mean? And that, from yesterday, the situation has changed completely.
Right.
So even in the third day, something could happen significantly. That will sway everything. And that standpoint, we've made it very, very clear. Those limitations are there. Those limitations are set. But like Prof says, when you set the limitations and you show the margins of error and you make them very, very clear, then you leave the interpretation very, very clearly. You can interpret this with wisdom.
Right. Angela, what was your point? I'll get to you. Say
Okay.
Okay. You know, David told me once that he respected my dad, who was a principal economist at
Statistician.
Treasury. But my dad, Dr. Odunda Mbitho, was also a statistician. He worked at KNBS now,
many
but
years,
it used to
He
be
was my
called
friend, yeah.
Central
CBS.
Bureau of Herufi House.
He was a good friend of mine.
Okay, I didn't know then that it was because of him I was going to do research. I had no clue, but I used to go with him in the Land Rover and go to the field as a little girl into Kajiado and wherever, not knowing why. But allow us to school you today as economists, because you're a bloody good economist, but we are bloody good researchers. So first and foremost, the first thing, David, is that voter register is not within the purview of only UDA or David Ndii or Azimio and your good self. It is something that we all have and are allowed to have access to. Any Kenyan, anybody in this room here can actually write to IEBC, including the cameraman, and get access to the register. Now, what does a good researcher do, like ourselves, and I will speak for myself and Ipsos, is that we then, because our universe, when we are talking to voters, anytime you're doing research, you ask yourself, what is your universe? Your universe could be young girls who like a specific kind of music. That then becomes your universe. And then you ask yourself, how many are there in Kenya? How many people like a specific musician? Let me not be biased and talk about just one, but I know Nameless. So how many people like Nameless, for instance? Okay, because he comes from my generation. And that then becomes your universe. Our universe for these particular polls is not any Kenyan, it's registered voter. Now, how do we get the statistics on registered voter? It's from the voter register, David. It can't come from the moon. So it's not something that we don't have access to. We may not have the exact details that political parties have, but we have the details enough for us to make the decisions we need to make. This is what you have in the study we gave you today. That becomes our base. So that's the first thing I need to actually correct, okay? It is not based on, it is based on the right foundation. Our universe is voter register 22.1 million as corrected and audited and provided by IEBC as their latest register. That's what we use to develop our sampling frame. How then do we move on to get our respondents? We get our respondents by asking them specific questions, which we normally call, what are they called? The questions that you ask?
Screener question.
Screener question, okay? You ask screener questions, and it is to screen and ensure. So, Jeff, when I call you, because we do computer-assisted telephone interviews using a database, a large database, which just runs, the first thing I'll ask you is, are you a registered voter? That's point number one. Secondly, do you intend to vote in the upcoming elections? No. If you do not intend to vote, first of all, if you're not a registered voter, we say, Asante sana, thank you very much for taking the time. Same thing if you go to the household and you use the cash grid. If you then say you're a registered voter, my second most important interest is, are you intending to vote? You can say yes or no. If you say no, I want to find out why. And when you tell me why, then I move on and ask you, what are the key issues that affect you as a Kenyan? Because just because you don't intend to vote does not mean you don't have pain points. So we'll ask you that. That's how we tell you what the key issues are: high cost of living, blah, blah, blah. But then for those who intend to vote, which majority of Kenyans that we interview today say they do, so the intention is high. It's always high. Then we continue with the additional questions. The candidate affinity, who you feel you're going to vote for, or your voter choice for every candidate, and also the key issues, okay? And trust in institutions, yeah? So David, we are not using adult Kenyans only. We zero down to actually the registered voter, and we use the voter register as our sampling guide, okay? That's one. So it's a 22.1 million. We then stratify in the sampling. We stratify this sample. So we get the IEBC register. We don't get the name of Jeff, which I think that's what he was talking about, that for political parties, they get, which I don't know whether the Data Protection Act allows them, anybody to have, but maybe political parties have access to where is Jeff registered, what is his ID number. We don't get that detail. What we get is what IEBC gives everyone. And that is what we use to run our sampling frame. That every Kenyan can have. And then we say, and it is given to you up to the ward level. So we stratify our sample up to the ward level. So David, our sample is built up from ward, and we take the 1450 wards, 290 constituencies. This is how the 6,000 and 9,000 samples before it have been built up. And then we have that constituting the 47 counties, and then now the 9 regions.
All right, my director's telling me I've got to take a break. I know you have a lot more to talk about, and to school David a little bit in...
I have to school this bloody good economist, who is a personal friend.
And I know... Saitabar, you have something to say as well. Let's take a quick break. We're talking numbers, folks. Numbers,
Okay.
crunching the numbers.
All right.
5 days to the general election. Have you made up your mind? Have you decided? It's up to you. Keep tweeting at Koinange Jeff, at Citizen TV Kenya, the hashtag JKLIVE. JKLIVE takes a break. We'll be back in a moment.